Okay, so in section 1.1, we're going to talk about kind of just some basics of geometry that we kind of build on. A lot of these are concepts that you're familiar with, but we want to make sure that we know how to communicate with each other and name these things so that when I'm talking about a certain line, you're talking about the exact same line. So that's basically what it comes down to. So we start with point, line, and plane, and you'll see here the point, it says it has no dimension, a line has one dimension, and a plane has two dimensions. So if something has no dimension, it doesn't have any width, doesn't have any depth, any thickness, it's just infinitely small. But of course we can't draw that, so instead we put a dot to represent it. Usually when we put a point, we'll also put a capital letter to name that point. So right there, that picture, that would be point A. I'll just write out point A. And then let's move on to line. A line has one dimension, so maybe you could say that it has length, but it doesn't have any thickness, it doesn't have any depth. So, and it can't change directions because it only has one dimension. So it doesn't curve or anything like that, it's just a line. And because it goes on forever, I didn't do a very nice job of doing my arrowheads, but because it goes on forever, we just kind of put an arrowhead on both sides to symbolize that it keeps on going forever. There are two ways that we can name a line. Sometimes we use a lowercase letter to name the line itself, and when we do that, we usually write the letter by like one of the arrowheads, like maybe I write a lowercase m there. And so I could say that this is line M. That's the name of, the name of it. But many times that we draw lines, we don't bother putting a lowercase letter there. So an alternative way, or a different way to name it, is to use two of the points that are on the line. There's actually an infinite number of points on a line. Since it goes on forever, I could put a point anywhere along there, and it goes on forever in both directions. But I only need two of them to name it. So pick two of the points that are on the line, and we can name them. I'll go ahead and label these as points A and point B. I want to point out the M that I did initially is not a point. The reason I know it's not a point, first of all, it doesn't have a dot. Secondly, it's not a capital letter. A point requires those two things, a dot and a capital letter. So A and B are points. So since I have 2 points, what can I call it? I can call it line AB, but because we're sometimes lazy and not wanting to write a lot, I don't write the word line. Instead, I do a little line symbol. And the line symbol is a little line with the two arrowheads on both sides. So I just put that symbol above it. So line AB. And really all I have to do is pick any two letters that are on there. So if there's more than 2 letters on it, just pick 2 of them. So maybe C was on there too. You could call it line AC as well. It's the same line. And I can also switch the order around. I could also call this line BA. It would be a different name for it, but it's the same line. A plane is a little bit trickier to draw. If it's going to have 2 dimensions, so it'll have length and it'll have width, but it won't have any depth. So it's similar to like maybe a sheet of paper, except it goes on forever, left, right, up, down, but it has no thickness at all. And a paper does have a little bit of thickness, so paper is not really a plane, but it's, it helps us understand a little bit of what a plane's like. So it's hard to draw that. Because it's hard to draw that, we really don't try to draw that. Instead, we usually draw like a parallelogram. On a line, we could go ahead and draw the arrowheads, and that worked nicely. It's not as easy to do that on a plane, so we don't. So I don't show in any way that it goes on forever to the left, to the right, up and down. We just have to understand that. When we see it, we kind of picture that in our mind, that it goes on forever. So how do we name a plane? There's a couple ways to do that. Sometimes we use just a single letter, kind of like we used a lowercase m for the line above. We can use a single letter to name a plane. But we don't use a lowercase one, we use a capital letter. And usually if you see it on a piece of paper, it's in bold print. Sometimes it's in bold. I can't really draw bold. I'm going to call this line or plane Q, and usually it's found in one of the corners of the parallelogram. So I put a Q there. So now I could call this plane Q. Please notice I did not do a dot by the Q. So it's not point Q. There is no dot there, so that's not a point. The Q has to be naming the whole plane. But then I could also use, and the way we usually name these is by using points that are on the plane. So I'm going to put some dots inside of this plane. I'm going to do 3 of them. It requires 3 points to name it. But they can't all be in the same line. In just a minute, we're going to talk about collinear points. They cannot be collinear. 2 of them can be on a line, but the third one can't be on the same line. So I would maybe make kind of a triangular type of pattern with my 3 points. I'll call them point A, B, and C. So notice these are capital letters, but they have dots. Q is a capital letter with no dots. So Q is not a point, but these 3 are. So I have 3 points that are not on the same line. So call it plane, and you can name it in any order you want on those 3 letters, but ABC, CBA, BAC, etc. But you can't use the letter Q there because it's not one of the points. The line below it, I already pointed out collinear points. I would recommend underlining collinear and coplanar. Those are kind of vocab terms. Those are kind of the points of this next sentence. Collinear, that means that they are on the same line. Collinear, same line. Coplanar means they're points that are on the same plane. And we'll come to those words here in just a second. So we're going to take a look at this example. You see a picture here. Example A, it says give 2 other names for line BQ and then also for plane R. So we'll start with line PQ. So if we look at the picture and we find the P and we find the Q, you see the line that passes through those. We're trying to give 2 other names for it. One way to name it differently is just to switch the order of the P and the Q. So I can call it line QP. And then if I continue to look at the line, there is no other point on that line. So I can't use a different letter, but there is a lowercase letter up at the arrowhead. It's not a point. It's on the arrowhead, so that it means they're naming it line in. So I can also call this line in. Okay. So I'll do a little slash there to separate the second part. So that was 2 names for PQ. Now they want 2 names for plane R. So if I look for the R, see in the bottom corner of this parallelogram is an R. It does not have a dot by it. So it's naming the plane. We can see that there's this parallelogram that's shaded. That's the plane we're looking at. We want to find different ways to name that plane. So I can't use the R again, so I have to use points that are on it. So what points even exist in this picture? V is a point, S is a point, P is a point, I is a point. M is not because it's a lowercase letter. N is not because it's a lowercase letter. Q is a point, but Q is not on this plane. Sometimes it's hard to draw these pictures, 3-dimensional pictures in 2 dimensions. So make sure you understand on this line, QP, there's a dotted section here, a dash section. So it's really showing that that plane is going, or this line is going down below. So it's kind of an up and down line where the plane is kind of side to side. So this line does not exist on that plane. Therefore, Q is actually kind of up in the air above the plane. So if the plane is my paper, my finger, it's kind of elevated up here. Maybe this is point Q. It's not actually down on the paper. So kind of understand this. So we will not use the letter Q. So we have to use 3 letters to name the plane. They can't use Q. It has to be 3 points. But I also said earlier they cannot be collinear. I cannot use S, P, and I because they're all on the same line. I can use 2 of those, but the third one cannot be on that line. So I could use S, P, and V. So plane SPV, because they're not all 3 on the same line, they kind of make a triangle. And it wants 2 other names, so another one could be S, V, and I. There's 3 letters that are also on that same plane and they're not in the same line. So those are 2 examples of how to name that. Part B there says name 3 points that are collinear. So 3 points that are on the same line. Make sure they're points, not lowercase letters. Can't use R, it doesn't have a dot. So the only 3 dots that are on the same line are S, P, and I. So that's what I have to use. Then the second part of this question says name 4 points that are coplanar. 4 points in the same plane. So once again, I can't use Q because it's not on the plane. But S, P, I, and V, those are the only options to use. You You can use them in whatever order you want, but those 4 letters all exist on that same plane. So that section is what we call undefined terms. Those don't technically have definitions, they kind of exist. Now we get into some definitions. So line is not a definition, but we're going to use this line as kind of a reference point for these next 2 things, segment and array. So a segment is really just a segment or a part of a line. So we see a line up here from through A and B. So a segment just stops. It doesn't go on forever. So maybe I'm starting at A and stopping at B. Oops. Mine wasn't very straight, I apologize. But I start at A, travel through B, and I stop there, and I don't want to keep on going. A lot of things that we look at in our world are really just segments. They don't continue forever. So that's a line segment. To name it, we can name it similar to a line. We have to use the endpoints. We don't want any of the points in between. We use the A and the B, and then we put a little line segment symbol above it. So we don't use the arrowheads this time. The only other way to name this segment is just to switch the order around and call it segment BA. No other way to name this one. Even if there was a point in the middle, you can't use it. You use the 2 endpoints. And then array. Array is kind of a combination of a segment and a line. So at one side, you're going to have an endpoint, A. The other side, it goes on forever. So that's array. Now, they're talking about a B, so I'm going to put a B on there somewhere. But it doesn't stop at B. It keeps on traveling forever. So when I want to name it, we usually take the endpoint, whatever letter is the endpoint. In this case, A is the endpoint. There's no arrow there. So we usually list that one first, and then we can pick any point that it goes through. So it goes through B, so I can use B. And then for the symbol that we put above it, it's just a little picture of array. But where we put that arrow matters. I can't put the arrowhead above A because A was an endpoint. A didn't travel through A, it stopped at A. But it did travel through B, that's why I have the arrowhead above it. So could I name this similar to the last problem? Can I switch the order around and call it array BA? Well, not if I do the arrowhead in the same place. This is really saying start at B and travel through A, so this is starting at B and going the other direction. It's not the same thing. I cannot call it that. If you do write BA, we usually wouldn't do this, but if you do write BA, you just have to put the arrowhead above the B, so you can have it kind of going backwards. That's acceptable. It's not really a different name so much. It's kind of the same name. It's just kind of written backwards. We'll go ahead and start the rest of this in a second video.